War has shaped kingdoms, erased empires, and rewritten the fate of nations. But on a handful of battlefields, something darker happened. Moments where humanity pushed itself to the edge, where courage, cruelty, desperation, and survival collided in ways almost too brutal to imagine. Frozen cities turned to graveyards, valleys where the air itself smelled like iron and smoke, and once great capitals that vanished in a single, apocalyptic storm. These are not just battles. They are scars, etched into the memory of civilization. And each one asks the same haunting question. How far can humans go when everything is at stake? Today we enter 6 battlegrounds where history reached its most violent extremes, and nothing was ever the same again. Winter came early to Stalingrad. Not the kind of winter that chills the skin, but the kind that claws its way into bone. When German soldiers marched into the city, many believed victory was already theirs. Hitler had promised that Stalingrad would fall within days. Instead, they walked straight into a furnace. Soviet defenders fought from shattered apartments, from factories with broken windows, from sewers crawling with smoke. Some soldiers battled each other from opposite sides of the same wall, firing through cracks hammered open with bayonets. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War, a nightmare of snipers, ambushes, and close-quarter combat so vicious that some units measured gains not in miles, but in rooms. Food ran out. Ammunition ran low. But the fighting only grew more desperate. And then winter tightened its grip. The temperature dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. Frostbite blackened fingers within hours. Men froze to death clutching rifles that had jammed solid with ice. Then came the moment no one expected. The Red Army closed the ring, a perfect Soviet encirclement. Over 250,000 Axis troops were suddenly trapped, cut off from supplies, trapped in a white wasteland of cold and starvation. General Paulus radioed Berlin. "We are surrounded." Hitler's reply was simple. "Surrender is forbidden." So the soldiers stayed, and Stalingrad became a cemetery without walls. By the end, more than 2 million casualties lay across the ruins, the deadliest battle in human history. And as the last German units surrendered, one truth became clear. The war had finally turned. And the Nazi dream of domination died here, frozen in the ruins of a city that refused to fall. Verdun was never meant to be a battlefield. It was supposed to be a fortress, a symbol of French resilience. But in February 1916, the German High Command launched a plan not meant to capture Verdun, but to bleed France dry. Their strategy had one chilling goal. Not victory. Destruction. The opening bombardment shook the earth. For 9 straight hours, over 1 million artillery shells rained down on a front barely longer than a city map. The ground liquefied. Trees disintegrated. Entire villages disappeared, literally erased from existence. What followed was a year-long descent into the mouth of hell. Soldiers fought knee-deep in mud. Bodies sank into the sludge, never recovered. The air tasted of metal, decay, and cordite. Fort Douaumont, one of France's most powerful fortresses, fell in hours. But recapturing it would take months, costing tens of thousands of lives. Men went into battle knowing they probably wouldn't return. And those who did return never really came back. By the end, over 700,000 casualties had been recorded, all for a battlefield that barely moved a few kilometers. And yet, the French held the line. Verdun never fell. The price was unbearable, but the message was eternal. Ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass. Verdun proved that even in a world drowning in gunfire and smoke, courage could still stand unbroken. October 25, 1415. A soaked, muddy field in northern France. King Henry V stood at the head of a starving, exhausted English army. Behind him, men weakened by disease, many barely able to stand. In front of him, a French force nearly 3 times larger, armored, confident, and furious. The French nobility saw victory as inevitable. But the battlefield had other plans. The night before, heavy rain had turned the open field into a swamp. deep mud that swallowed legs and trapped horses. Henry positioned his longbowmen on the flanks, their stakes planted firmly in the ground. When the French cavalry charged, the arrows began to fall. Not a few. Thousands, a black cloud slicing through the air. Armored knights stumbled, slipped, collapsed on top of each other. The narrow field funneled them into a chaotic crush of bodies. Men drowned in mud, suffocated under piles of fallen soldiers, or were finished by English blades moving calmly between gaps in armor. Longbows, simple wood and string, shattered the illusion of knightly invincibility. By the end, the French nobility had been decimated, and the English, against all odds, walked away victorious. Agincourt was not just a battle. It was the moment medieval warfare died, swallowed by mud, arrows, and the sharp reality that technology always rewrites the rules. Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world. A city of scholars, poets, astronomers, and libraries that held the knowledge of centuries. A place where ideas flourished and empires found wisdom, until the Mongols arrived. In January 1258, Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, surrounded the city with a force that moved like a storm, precise, merciless, unstoppable. 4 days, Mongol trebuchets hurled stones the size of oxen into Baghdad's walls. Explosive firepots illuminated the night sky, turning it blood red with flame. When the defenses collapsed, the apocalypse began. The Mongols entered the city and unleashed one of the deadliest sackings in human history. Thousands were killed within hours. The caliph was captured, executed, reportedly rolled inside a carpet and trampled to avoid spilling royal blood. But the greatest tragedy happened not in the streets, but in the rivers. Baghdad's legendary libraries, filled with mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, were dragged to the Tigris. Books were thrown into the water until the river reportedly ran black with ink. Baghdad, once the center of the world's knowledge, fell silent. The city never fully recovered, and with it, a golden age ended. The early morning of October 14, 1066 was tense and cold. On a hilltop near Hastings, the Anglo-Saxon army formed a shield wall, a human fortress of shields, spears, and stubborn defiance. At the foot of the hill waited the Normans, led by William the Conqueror. Cavalry, archers, infantry, a modern force against an ancient one. The first Norman assault crashed into the shield wall and shattered like waves against a cliff. Again and again they charged, and again they broke. But William had a plan. He ordered a feigned retreat, something unheard of in England. As the Normans pretended to flee, parts of the Anglo-Saxon line broke formation and chased them down the slope. That was the mistake. The Normans turned, surrounded the pursuers, and tore the English line apart. As chaos spread, Norman arrows arced overhead. And then, the moment that changed a kingdom. A single arrow struck King Harold, piercing his eye. The English resistance collapsed. And with it, a way of life ended. The Normans took control. And England was transformed forever. Its language, its culture, its rulers, its laws. One battle. One arrow. One new world. Picture a vast plain in southern Italy. The sun rising over rows of Roman soldiers. Nearly 80,000 men, the largest army Rome had ever assembled. They marched with confidence. Rome had never imagined defeat on this scale. Across the field waited Hannibal, commander of Carthage, a military genius even his enemies feared. He had fewer men, but he had something far more powerful. A plan so precise it is still studied 2,000 years later. Hannibal arranged his lines in a crescent, thin in the middle, strong on the wings. When the battle began, the Roman infantry pushed forward, forcing the center backward, believing they were breaking the Carthaginian line. But that was exactly what Hannibal wanted. As the Romans pressed in tighter, Carthaginian troops on the flanks swung inward, closing like the jaws of a trap. The Romans were surrounded, completely encircled, packed so tight many couldn't even raise their swords. What followed was one of the most efficient massacres in military history. Hour after hour, Hannibal's forces cut down the Roman army until nearly 50,000 soldiers lay dead. One battle wiped out an entire generation of Roman leadership. It was the worst defeat in Rome's history. And yet, Rome refused to die. They rebuilt, regrouped, and eventually crushed Carthage. But at Cannae, for one terrible morning, Hannibal stood unmatched. Across these 6 battlefields, the world changed. Empires rose and fell. Armies shattered. Legends were born. And entire civilizations were rewritten by moments of unimaginable brutality. But these battles share one thing. They weren't just fights between armies. They were turning points, moments where the future of humanity hung in the balance. Stalingrad froze the Nazi war machine. Verdun tested the limits of human endurance. Agincourt ended the age of knights. Baghdad's fall ended a golden age of knowledge. Hastings reshaped the kingdom. Kenny redefined the art of war. These weren't battles. They were warnings, etched in history, whispered through time, reminding us that the world we know today exists only because of the unimaginable sacrifices made on fields long forgotten. And somewhere beneath the soil of every one of these places, the past is still waiting.